One of the most common areas we discuss with our clients is around using CRO to optimise forms. This is particularly important as forms are often the start of the conversion process, but all too often they're also the place where visitors abandon their journeys. So today I'm joined by Alun Lucas, Managing Director of Zuko, a form analytics tracking and optimisation provider, to discuss the advantages and pitfalls of form design. Alun, who suffers the most from bad forms? Is it particular markets or company size?
Well, I mean, technically, I think you can find bad forms in any area, but what we tend to find, just to flip the question slightly, those that can benefit the most from form optimization and improving their forms, they tend to fall into one of three pots or a combination of them. The most common one is if they have complex forms. So if you're asking more questions or difficult questions, then it's more likely that you're going to mess things up and have a bad form and a bad design that puts people off. Categories 2 and 3 are kind of related. So first one is a high cost of customer acquisition. So obviously if you're paying a lot to get your customers, if you have bad form design, it affects you more disproportionately. And then the third piece is customer lifetime value. So if you have a high customer lifetime value, obviously, if you can improve your form from bad to good, then you're going to see a bigger return. Now, in terms of the question around, okay, who suffers most of it, is say typically when you're looking at bad design, it probably is the more complex forms that tend to have bad design. Although, as I say, anyone can have bad error messages or bad validation. And we see that often, and for us, we see a lot of forms and we do a lot of work in financial services sector because they do have complex forms and they have forms that are necessarily somewhat complex because they have regulatory requirements. However, they tend to make it more difficult for themselves. They will overcomplicate things over and above what they need to do, or they'll structure a form that's very difficult for the user to make their way through and to pass, and a thousand other errors that we see that cause bad user experiences and bad user forms, if that makes sense.
So presumably it's more B2C rather than B2B, although I do know that B2B companies use forms as well. Would you say it's predominantly B2C?
Certainly, yes, we see that a lot more because the forms tend to be complex and not exclusively, particularly in financial services. Often what you'll see in B2B is it's kind of a lead generation, lead capture. Mm-hmm. So you're just looking to capture someone's contact details so you can follow them up with a direct sales. So we still see this done badly on a number of occasions, asking for things that are unnecessary, problems with validation or refusing to accept email addresses if they're a Gmail account and things like that, which basically hurt the user experience and hurt conversion. But overall, yes, B2C, purely often because of the sheer volume that you see going through a form, we see companies who have more issues in the B2C space.
You mentioned the word complex forms, and that can be complex, could be, 10 fields, or it could be 50 fields in some financial institutions and things like that. Is there an optimal length of form?
It's an interesting question, and that's kind of one that's often a little controversial. I suppose in general, you would have the principle that if you don't need to ask something, don't ask it, because there's obviously always is a chance that someone will be put off by it. However, having said that, length of form isn't necessarily the determinant of conversion rates. And I'll give you an example. So we have a lot of benchmarking data at Zuko because we see a lot of forms. Mm-hmm. And what we see is actually the sector with the highest conversion rate is local government. And they are also the sector which have the longest forms. So you're seeing, extremely high completion rates, but extremely long forms, which, if you were to take the fact that long is bad, you would say, what's going on here? So there are other factors at play that are more important than the length of form. In this particular case, for local government, it tends to be because they have a monopoly on services. So where are you going to go to get the same service? And so people are very motivated to complete the form. So motivation trumps length. in that case.
That's really intriguing that, that you can think that the local council has the highest conversion rates.
Yes.
When you think that, in my experience, local councils have some of the poorest website designs around. They're functional rather than customer journey centric, although it is getting better, I have to say. So it does surprise me, but that monopolistic area, obviously people want to get something and they're not going to be able to get it somewhere else, so they have to trudge through the form often.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also sort of another example from a different angle, you sometimes see it with forms, if you cut them down too much, your conversion rate goes down. So if someone's expecting to, I'll use an example, they apply for a mortgage or another financial product, and you're asking 3 or 4 questions, sometimes it's like, actually, you'll see that people are expecting to provide more. So actually, if you look too bare, then actually conversion rates can go down, and there are a few studies that have shown this as well. So again, it's not necessarily about the length; it's about what's right. So yes, the general principle is if you don't need to ask something now, don't ask it, but be cognizant of all the other factors at play that will affect your conversion rate, and don't get too hung up on trying to cut your form down to 3 fields if realistically it needs to be longer.
One of the bugbears that I've got, and this is a personal bugbear, it doesn't represent the views of our company, is that forms have now taken the place of human interaction. And therefore, when you get stuck in a form because the question may be ambiguous, it's very difficult to be able to overcome what you're expecting to put into that field. Do you find that's part of it, is that people are trying to be able to reduce overheads by having forms as opposed to humans?
I think it's a fair point. I think it's probably putting that in a broader business context of customer support, trying to make everything digital. I think it's not necessarily forms. The form itself is always going to require information. If you need to fill out a form, again, I'm going to use the mortgage application, you're going to need to provide that information. And the fact that you don't do it now in person, your bank manager is say it's not necessarily the forms issue. It's just it's a broader business issue of cost cutting. But interestingly enough, we have sort of clients in India where we look at their forms, and there's certainly a different dynamic at play there, because the user rarely fills out the form. Often right. What happens is the agent fills out the form. It could be face to face, but usually on a phone. So they'll be speaking to the customer and asking the questions and then tapping in that themselves. So actually you can see that different markets have different solutions to it. Obviously in the West, often it is about cutting the costs rather than having that customer service, if that makes sense.
Is there a way of interrupting the form filling to be able to provide more information? So say, for instance, you've got a particular question that says, please provide the last 3 addresses that you lived at over the last 12 years, or whatever it might be, some ambiguous thing like that. If you were to put in, say, a tooltip or a help button or something like that, does that decrease the conversion rate?
No, typically a lot of friction in forms is around that error messaging and the instructional copy, giving people tips on how to do it, making sure it's clear what they should be doing. And using your very specific example, it's an interesting one because that is one of the questions we see often drives abandonment, which is give me your last 3 addresses or your addresses over the last 3 years, because if they've moved in different places, they often can't remember their addresses. They've got to go back. They've got to try and find it. So it's often an issue. And we often say to our clients to say, okay, well, even a tip like have a look on your Amazon account, because actually, if you want to find your history, Amazon knows a lot more about your history than you can probably remember.
That's a really good idea, actually.
If you go in there, you'll see all your old addresses, unless you've purposely deleted them. Mm-hmm. So actually, that's just an individual tip for that. But in terms of your general point, yes, giving tips, giving advice is crucial, particularly in complex forms. Again, go back to the mortgage example. If you're asking for someone's gross income, what does that mean? You're assuming that people know what it means. They generally won't do that. What if particularly if you're asking for their assets or their wealth? What do you mean then? And it's absolutely critical in having a tip which tells us.
You're listening to the shortened version of this podcast. To listen to the full version, visit your favourite podcast player and search for Webtrends Optimize or The Big Lift.